Craig, this is what I was referring to last night, talking about Jamar. And it's not about left or right, it's about right or wrong. It's not about faction, it's about principle.
People campaigning for crap that I have no interest in, that I don't like, that I could never support. And almost every one of the messages that I see come in is about how we got to stop this team. And that's the messaging that is prevalent in almost everything today. Adam said, "This, in my humble apprehension, is to be dreaded as the greatest political evil under our Constitution." And even as Mercy Otis Warren years later, when Adams was president, she thought he had become more of a monarchist rather than an Atlas of Independence, an advocate for freedom. And even at that point, he was upsetting the Federalists and Alexander Hamilton, and that's part of why he lost the next round. But that's maybe another story that I can get to at another time. But why? What is the problem with faction? I think we all know this inherently. But there's a history of problems with this. And James Madison, like so many other founders, was a great student of history. And here's how he explained it in the Virginia Ratifying Convention. This is June 6, 1788. Madison said, "On a candid examination of history, we shall find that turbulence, violence, and abuse of power by the majority trampling on the rights of the minority have produced what? Factions and commotions, which in republics have more frequently than any other cause produced despotism." So at least at the time of ratification, the so-called father of the Constitution is telling us that the problems that led to despotism more than anything else in a republic came out of factions, or a faction-first approach. He said, if we go over the whole history, the entire history, which no one today does, of ancient and modern republics, we shall find their destruction to have generally resulted from those causes. And Madison, of course, was not alone. Here's a few people I don't ever cite. Abraham Williams, 1762, an election sermon in Boston. I like citing these because it shows how different things are from the pulpit today. Not that I'm really one that's following much, but I certainly understand how they're not as engaged talking about liberty and issues of the power of government. But this was an important thing at the time of the revolution. And when I talk about the revolution, I'm talking about the revolution in thought that was going on from 1761 through the time when the war commenced. So here's Abraham Williams in Boston. He said, "As the natural body is more frequently destroyed by internal orders than in external violence, so factions, divisions, and parties in the state are more dangerous and have more frequently proved fatal than foreign enemies." I know James Iredell at one point, he ended up becoming one of the first Supreme Court justices, an associate justice. He said, people more often than not will actually destroy their own liberty through dissensions among themselves, through this faction-first approach. Here's David Osgood. And if you think about the year 1794, what was going on over in Europe, this was a big deal talking about faction, and I will get to Noah Webster's great paper on it in just a moment. But David Osgood, another sermon in Boston, 1794, he said, "In every country, the men of ambition," basically everyone in government, "the men of ambition who covet the chief seats in government exert all their abilities to ingratiate themselves with the source of power." In a monarchy, the source of power is a little different than in a republic or a democratic republic or a federal system, whatever you want to call it. It's a little different. And he was recognizing that in a republic, things were far different than in a monarchy. He said thousands and millions are the object whom they would influence. Of course, the more popular any government is, so the more it is a government of the people, or we the people of the several states, the more popular it is, the more liable it is to be agitated and rent by parties and factions. Now, parties and factions can be used, I guess, in some ways interchangeably, but it's certainly in some ways not. And I'll get to that in just a moment as well. Here's the title of the episode, just so you don't know. If you're watching, you can see up on the screen this quote, great quote from Noah Webster. It wasn't just me putting a title for this episode that was kind of just a little flamboyant, we'll call it, but that's how Noah Webster called it. He said, "Faction is death to liberty. And here he is writing on the French Revolution in 1794. Certainly there was great concern of what might happen elsewhere. George Washington, and I'm not going to cover Washington because I always do when I talk about faction. Maybe I will briefly, but he certainly warned in his farewell address, originally drafted in 1792 by James Madison and revised by Alexander Hamilton, all of course with Washington's heavy influence. But he warned significantly in 1796 about the danger of faction. They saw what they saw, and they were very, very concerned about it. So Noah Webster said, faction is death to liberty. If you think about things in a faction-first approach, you will have no liberty. And even though we do have the opportunity to exercise some rights, in most situations, we're not doing it, whether the government wants us to or not. We're doing it just because the government is choosing not to violate those particular rights at this particular time. Anyways, Webster continued on a little bit later. He said, party spirit is the source of faction. So to Webster, he recognized, and many of the founders recognized, that people would naturally move towards one team or another. But faction is a little deeper when you're thinking about it in a party first. So he said party spirit is the source of faction, and then, of course, it leads to tyranny. Tyranny. And he said nothing is more dangerous to the cause of truth and liberty than a party spirit. Nothing. Now, other founders had different concerns about what is more dangerous to liberty. James Otis, some years earlier, a couple decades, about 30 years earlier, somewhere around that, he thought the most dangerous thing to liberty was a prevailing opinion that it would be better to tamely submit to government rather than to vindicate your privileges. Noah Webster in 1794 had a different view, but for him it was nothing is more dangerous to the cause of both truth and liberty than a party spirit. And Mike Meharry, in a blog post, short one that we published yesterday, covering a little bit of George Washington's views and also Thomas Gordon, who I'll get to in a moment, he put it this way: a faction-first mentality leads to tyranny. And I don't even know if he was citing Webster there or highlighting that kind of a view, but that's a very common position that we agree with fully over here at TAC. And Mike says, put in more modern terminology, faction first really means party first. In other words, looking at something as right or wrong based on who is doing it or guess what team is doing it, rather than the Constitution or whether or not it advances liberty or anything at all. And Noah Webster talked about this as well in some depth in that same paper, which I will link to in the show notes. I publish a blog post for each episode about 1 to 2 hours after the live stream is done. So that's where you're going to find all the reference links. If you're on YouTube, for example, I'll generally post a link to that show page. Not always, but I'm trying to be a little bit more consistent with that so you guys can look up these resources and do your homework on your own time. Homework, wow. So here's how Webster put it. When men become members of a political club, they lose their individual independence of mind, that they lose their impartiality of thinking and acting and become the dupes of other men. The moment a man is attached to a club, his mind is not free. He receives a bias from the opinions of the party. A question indifferent to him is no longer indifferent when it materially affects a brother of the society. So he's talking about this transition from individual thinking, individual responsibility to concern over how it's going to affect my team. And a lot of people certainly do this. I know we're not doing that kind of thing here, but this is I see this as one of the greatest problems we face today, if not like what Webster said, the greatest threat we face. But he goes on, he says, he is not left to act for himself. He is bound in honor to take, well, there's not much honor these days, but there sure is a lot of loyalty to the wrong place. He is not left to act for himself. He is bound in honor to take part with the society. His pride and his prejudices, if at war with his opinion, will commonly obtain the victory. And rather than incur the ridicule or censure of his associates, he will countenance their measures at all hazards. And thus an independent freeman is converted into a mere walking machine, a convenient engine of party leaders. Man, I think I could just wrap it up with that, but I definitely have more that I want to share with you on this.
So it's not about left or right. It's about right. or wrong.